fantastic presentation, and some of your drawings are just wonderful to actually look at, and I think they really do tell the story, and I'm thinking of the ones, maybe you could put a couple back on actually, but the ones there, I think the second last slide that you showed, because it's a project that's at two scales. One of them is the city, or what's happened to the city, and the other one is the room, or the detail.
Yeah.
And the bit in between is, so it seems to make sense at those two scales, and I think you've tried to sort of say that. When you put it all together, it may not be like that.
Yeah.
That's what you're saying, isn't it?
Yeah.
But look, it's very, very convincing, I think, at the scale of the city and at the scale of the detail, and I appreciate what you're trying to do here.
But obviously it's based at this side, and this is where my interest has been at, specifically at this side. But it's, from those earlier images, it's potential that, because the original idea was about identifying this service core and the blank wall that is adjacent to it. So it's, it's something that happens throughout the city. It's not just about this building, but maybe not in the future. But it's not necessarily about grabbing ship fragments and for every single building in the city. But it's about understanding,
being inventive.
About understanding that idea that there's this opportunity and these service cores to add density, to add, a bit more flair to the city.
Interesting project, and I haven't had a chance to read what you've written here, but I would imagine that you would have had, there's a number of things that call to mind. There's John Harbraken's supports system, which was an idea brought up in Holland about building land in the air or sites, and you infill it with components. Martin Pauly went on to suggest you could get repackaging done so that you could package components and people could buy, have their cornflakes and use the cornflakes packets to help build walls and things. That was an idea that came through in the 70s. Then thinking about the biker wall and Ralph Erskine's identifying places for identity or communal gathering and things like that. But I think whatever it is, I would imagine you would have to develop principles for the technology of adherence and how you put the old and the old together, like just the technique, and how you would then imagine that it would add to something that existing that's lacking, that you would have a way of arguing. And the third one would be that you would have some idea of what the spatial commitment is. So there's the technology, there's the space, and then there's the missing components. So because you want to value add, not just because it's old, but because it's going to give you something that you don't already have in many of these undernourished buildings that we're putting up. So there's lots of scope, but you need to develop, I would imagine, what those principles are. Yeah. And in drawing this, we can't see it, but there might be other drawings in here, which I'll have a look at. But it's a really interesting idea, but I think it needs that. You need to show us what the order of the thinking is, to convince, not that it can be realised, but that you can actually see the thinking that has gone into those three levels. You know what I'm trying to say?
Peter, Richard. Well done. No, what a struggle.
Lots of
and what I there's a few things that I really love about it, Troy. One, your tenacity. Two, your love and sense for Newcastle, past, present, and possibly future. Three, I remember very much our early discussion back in first term about the nature of accretion on the waterfront, like how a pile grows, right? How the shellfish and the mussels and the oysters take over, and the weeds, all at different levels, and you've managed to do that. And the third thing that I really love is your sense of social justice that began with the whole thing. Like, you, any more than the rest of us, don't like those apartments that have taken over from the Newcastle Hospital, and continually annoy us, anger even that the city can't see, that maybe that hospital building could have been the heart of something that could have grown more over time. And you were really upset about that, and you wanted to take those buildings and show how possibly over time they could become back into the people's domain. So I just commend you really highly for your following it through. And what Britt was saying about its actual workings, we talked about that a lot, and that's a big issue to follow through. But you know, your first steps, I think, are great. And the fourth thing is your learning curve and your making curve. Steel suddenly becomes a new material for you, and it's very beautiful. Well done.
I think when we first saw it in term 1 or semester 1, I was dubious about the way you're going about it, but I reckon you've really you've changed that factor, you know, almost reversed it 180 degrees, and it's a really strong idea now. It's a brilliant idea in terms of the actual idea itself. What I really like about it is how much you've changed the nature of the building, because those new buildings, like Nick said, they aren't pretty. They're pretty ugly buildings. And so there's this wonderful sort of handcrafted quality that's coming into it, or fabricated quality that's coming into it, which is really good. And also the equality thing, I think, is very important. But one of the things that I think you've missed in terms of your presentation is the roofscape and what might happen on the roofscape, because you've suddenly made it an area of opportunity to develop and to use, and the streetscape. And what happens on those two places. You've shown the building as an architectural modification, change, renovation, restoration, whatever. But those two elements, I think, are really critical to your scheme, particularly if you've got cranes up there where you can lift up like people for the weekend, or tents, or a circus, or performance, or whatever. And particularly at the street where you're lifting these things up, so trucks and services and all sorts of things. I think they're the opportunities we haven't seen in the drawings. But I really, and I think the interaction between you and Tom in terms of why not do a ship was fantastic. That was a huge step. It was a great step, and initiating that and applying it and seeing how well it works, or potentially how well it can work. And when you travel overseas, quite often the good buildings are the buildings that people have deserted, and there's other people coming in and occupying, and there's like a little shutter going up and a towel hanging out the window, and a door being boarded up, and they've got life about them, and that's what you've done with this building. You've given it serious life, and so it would almost be a register in the city of what was going on, right? Rather than these blank facades that say nothing except when the lights get turned on. So I think it's quite a very creative answer actually to this problem that you identified, which is how do you change things and make them more socially equal and opportune for people, which is great. Good on you.
Are you going to do one?
I'd love to.
You're going to build one?
That's the next step, isn't
Yeah,
it?
but you could take one component and try and talk someone into using it for a cafe, or, I just think you don't stop with that thing, because that's how you find out. Like, where would it fit, and how would you fit it, and what would it do? Would it just become a gimmick, or can you get,
Imagine a streetscape, you bring this back, this thing, and just push it in and start using it. It's a little coffee cafe pop-up. Heat up cafe.
Well, you could just leave it in the harbour, couldn't you?
I think it's a sort of thing you can experiment with, can't you? So I think that's the next thing to try to do. You've got all the time in the world after this.
Exactly.
Okay?
Tom?
Look, I concur with what everyone has said, and I particularly appreciate Rick mentioning this kind of struggle that you engaged with, because the project you presented to me perhaps has, you can see the bones of it here, but you introduced a whole new DNA, and I think the consistent thing through it, which I really appreciate and admire that you've always had, is this ability and desire to craft. And so even when you weren't sure where the project was going, you were still building these things, even though you weren't quite sure how you would use them. And so I think this ability to craft your way through a problem, simply via the sheer delight of making, this is a strength you have. And so I think for sure you should do one, because now that you can weld, piece of cake, right? And so, but I find the project, along with what Peter said, it's an act of resistance, right? Because it says, how do we do alts and adds without adding enormous amounts of space and without going out and procuring millions of dollars worth of new materials? So it's alts and adds in which the new is in fact something old, and you get less space. I think it's quite beautiful. Like, it would shake up the entire real estate and development industry. You have less when you add more? We don't understand it. And so to me, that's the DNA of the project, in terms of its potential social, political, economic dimension. And it sits there, kind of I love the term the undernourished building, and because it's quite right, So you give it an infusion of iron, right? It's quite anemic. So you add some grunt to it, and that grunt, and yes, I agree that the topographical investigations, the sky, the ground, all of those things, but those are the next step. That's what you can test at 1-to-1. And really I think, very rarely do you see student projects that have that kind of nature within them that you could immediately see you working next weekend on the 1-to-1 version of it. So very well done.
It ties in very well. Who's the American sculptor who does the big things in steel?
Richard Serra.
Richard Serra, but there's another one as well. Like, his name's just slipped my memory, but he talked about the industrial sites of our present cities are the new cities of the future, rising into ruins, is the way he put it. It's a very nice way of looking at it.
Okay. Well, thank you.